Okay. Welcome tonight. A reminder, before Greg comes up to share with us, that next week is our Christmas party. So online you can find all the information about that. But next week, Adrian and Angie have arranged a very special wine and cheese Christmas party for us. So, yes, David. We're starting here. So from 7:30 to just a bit after 8, we'll be here. And then those of us who want to go to the Christmas party afterwards, will go to the Christmas party, which actually starts at 8:30. Okay, so it's both. Thanks for the question. So Pastor Greg, as I found out from Holly, his wife, has published dozens of articles on C.S. Lewis and is one of the most published authors on this great figure. For those of you who are new to C.S. Lewis is the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, which several movies have been made out of, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and The Dawn Treader. So I'm sure Pastor Greg will give us more background on C.S. Lewis, but this great British professor and scholar is probably the seminal or the greatest Christian thinker of the past century. So let's give a warm welcome to Pastor Greg as he speaks to us about C.S. Lewis.
Matthew and Oasis, thank you for inviting me. Two recent C.S. Lewis stories. I spoke at Queen's College a few weeks ago, and in fact it was the day that C.S. Lewis and John Kennedy and Aldous Huxley all had died in 1963, November 22nd. So I said, how many of you have heard of C.S. Lewis? And I was talking to a group of about 50 of their best and the brightest. These were people who've won scholarships to universities next year, completely paid by Queen's College, and only 2 had heard of C.S. Lewis. So I'm going to see if we're brighter than they. How many of you have heard of C.S. Lewis? Oh, what a bright group today. All right. Second story is, those of you who attend Union Church, you may see a really cool-looking guy from Canada with this big, white, bushy beard. He looks like Santa Claus, except he's about 100 kilos too thin to be Santa Claus. His name is Terry Legg. Now, his son is a famous financial guy here in Hong Kong, and his great-great-great-great-great relative was James Legg, who actually founded Union Church. But I was talking to Terry Legg this week, and Terry Legg said, oh, I was C.S. Lewis's next-door neighbor. Terry Legg, Canadian now, but grew up in Oxford, actually North Headington, and right next to the kilns where C.S. Lewis had a house. How many of you have ever been to C.S. Lewis's house in Oxford? Don't ask me for directions. I get lost every time. But it's a beautiful old house that's been restored. It wasn't beautiful when Lewis lived in it. But Terry Legg said that C.S. Lewis was a shadowy, scary figure because Terry Legg and his brothers and sisters would sneak over to the Lewis house to to swim in the pool and to steal apples. And Lewis, by that time, was living in Cambridge and was only home on weekends. But he had a full-time gardener by the name of Paxton. And Terry said Paxton was very, very scary, but very, very slow, so they never got caught. A few years ago, I gave a lecture on C.S. Lewis at the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity. And I said, how many of you ever met C.S. Lewis? And 10 people raised their hands. Now, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of people left who have met C.S. Lewis. Like I said, he died in 1963. But for tonight, I'd like to look at kind of a more personal Lewis, rather than the great hero, the great writer we all talk about. He was a fragile human being. In fact, on the 50th anniversary of his death, there was a really nasty article that was written about him, the C.S. Lewis You Never Knew. And he did have some rather unusual characteristics, and the writer with great glee talked about them, but I just want to mention one or two. His religious books actually made him poor. He's one of the best-selling authors of the 20th century, and by the way, he's doing incredibly well in the 21st century. 10 million copies of the Narnia books have sold since 2000. But Lewis had made a promise to God that all the money from his books would go to charity. But there's a problem. How many of you have lived in England? Do they have taxes there? High taxes there? He gave the books away, but he still had to pay taxes on the royalties. So until his dying day in 1963, his greatest fear was not illness, but going into poverty. But the one that really kind of got to me, he had a horrible personal life. Now, I was going to entitle this Sex, Singles, and Christmas. But there's a really interesting debate about C.S. Lewis because he was a real down-to-earth person. Let's see how much we know about him. He was born in 1898. Where was he born? Belfast, Northern Ireland. He's an Ulsterman. When he was 9 years old, his perfect childhood ended when his mother died. And he prayed to God, and by the way, his grandfather was a clergyman, to heal his mother from cancer, and she died. So at the age of 9, he started disbelieving in God. He had a horrible experience in 3 different private, or I guess in England you'd call them public schools. He was trained in Bookham, Surrey by an atheist by the name of Kirkpatrick. And this is where Lewis learned how to be a debater. This is where Lewis was prepared to go to Oxford. Now, did you know that Lewis flunked the Oxford entrance exams? He was absolutely useless in math. And it was brilliant in everything else, but in order to get into Oxford, you had to have a math exam. And so he was really, really struggling with what to do when, let's think, he was born in 1898. What happened in the world around 1913, 1914, 1915? Right, the Great War. And so they let Lewis in. They waived the math exam. He started taking classes at what's called University College, Oxford. And then he enlisted in the Army, because everybody enlisted in the Army at that time. And he was able to stay at Oxford for officers training school. He switched to Keble College. And there his roommate was a young Irishman by the name of Paddy Moore. And Paddy Moore and Lewis were not best friends at first, but they became best friends. And they made a pact, a promise to each other. And that is, if one of them died in the war, the other one would take care of the other's family. Well, Lewis was wounded in World War II. Unfortunately, it was a British shell that landed. It was friendly fire. And so he got... How many of you watched Downton Abbey? Okay. You've heard the term blighty? You know what a blighty is? A blighty is the wound that requires you to go back to England for treatment, but doesn't permanently disfigure you. Everyone was looking for a blighty wound because it was a way out of this horrible conflict. By the way, Lewis's biographers, and there are a bunch, and I'm going to mention a few if we have time, are fascinated by the fact that Lewis never talks about his war experience. In his book, Surprised by Joy, he relates 3 chapters to how horrible his boarding schools were. But he mentions World War II just in passing. Why do you think that would be? I think that's right. How many of you, be really honest, it's not going to hurt my feelings, how many of you like Tolkien more than Lewis? Really, Tolkien, in many ways, some people say that Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is really World War I. Tolkien used these horrible, creative, terrible things that he saw and used them in a creative way. By the way, Tolkien lost all his friends. Tolkien was with like 15 brother officers, and Tolkien, I think, was the only one who survived the war. But that generation, they just didn't talk about it. But Patty Moore died. Patty Moore left a mother and a sister, Maureen. Now, Mrs. Moore was not divorced, but she was separated from her husband. She was 45 years old, the very age that Lewis's mother was when she died. And this paper and this biography called The Narnian by Alan Jacobs. This biography, which just came out, C.S. Lewis Alive by Alistair McGrath. All of them have a big debate. But the consensus is that Lewis had a sexual relationship with this Mrs. Moore. You're all too young to know the movie The Graduate with Dustin Hoffman. Classic, right? Thanks, movie buff. Simon and Garfunkel, Hello, Mrs. Robinson. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so this newspaper article and the biographies are struggling with the fact that Lewis had this very, very unusual relationship, whether it was sexual or not, with a woman 20 years older than him, until this woman died not too many years before Lewis died. And by the way, she was a person with dementia towards the end of her life. It was just a horrible situation. Lewis had one brother by the name of Warnie who was an alcoholic. So the household had C.S. Lewis, a young girl named Maureen, and then a woman who was on the verge of going crazy, and then an alcoholic brother of C.S. Lewis. And so it was a pretty difficult life. Lewis was a young adult. He was an atheist. He was sexually promiscuous. He fits right in with most young adults today, right? And this article says, hey, this is terrible because he's the guy who wrote Mere Christianity, where he makes an incredibly strong case for chastity and singleness and fidelity in marriage. Well, Lewis goes on to say, yet he completely stands by that, but in his 20s and until he was 30 or 31, because this is a big change just in the last few years, Lewis was an atheist. Lewis smoked and he drank. And he drank, and he drank, and he smoked, and he smoked. And how in the world can we have this great Christian writer who was such a partier? He was a tremendous partier as a young man. His brother, before he became an alcoholic, Warnie, survived World War I, and guess where he was stationed? It's a place out in the east called Hong Kong. Guess where he stayed? Guess where the British officers stayed when Warnie first came to Kowloon? The Peninsula Hotel. The Peninsula Hotel had just been built, and the first occupants were British officers. And Lewis wrote to Warnie, and Warnie would write back and tell him how terrible Hong Kong was. It was hot. He didn't like Chinese people. Warnie says some incredibly rude things about Chinese people. And Matthew in the Well, I think you were here about a year ago. Matthew asked me to give a lecture in the Well where I read some of these things, and they were just terrible. And a Chinese woman came up to me and she says, I forgive him because he was ignorant. But these were interesting times. The war was over, and Lewis got his degree. Actually, he got 3 degrees. He has 3 firsts in Oxford, one of the few people to do it. In the greats, which would be classic, in philosophy, and then English literature. And he was one of the very first English literature professors, never got to be a professor, tutors at Oxford. but he wasn't a Christian. Then there was a conversion experience. And until Alistair McGrath, who taught at Oxford till about a year ago, he's now at King's College London, did some research, and he found out that Lewis really couldn't keep track of dates. For years, people have been saying that Lewis became a Christian in 1929. And Mr. McGrath has kind of proven that it was really 1930. But it was an interesting conversion experience. He went from being an atheist to believing that there could be a God because of long conversations with J.R.R. Tolkien, we've all heard of, and some of you like him too much, and Hugo Dyson. Have any of you ever heard of Hugo Dyson? Another Christian, and they would go on long walks in the evening at Oxford, and Lewis said, these are two of the smartest people in Oxford, and they believe in God. There must be something that I have to check out. So he started believing that there could be a Christian God, and then he began to believe in a true myth, and then he started to believe that Jesus was the Son of God, and then either in 1931 or 1932, Lewis said, I have crossed over. I believe that Jesus is God. And by the way, if you've read Mere Christianity, there are 4 sections of the book, and it kind of traces the conversion that he would like us all to have. Well, that's the end of my lecture for right now. We talked about Lewis and sex and singleness and young adulthood, but I'm stopping right where you guys are. He became a Christian when he was either 30 or 31. And he was a tutor at Magdalen College in Oxford, and he was just establishing himself as a teacher when we'll stop the narrative. Lewis and Christmas. Now, think of movies you've seen or books you've read. What's the most famous C.S. Lewis quote about Christmas? There's a witch involved. Okay? Bingo. And it's about winter. It's always winter, but never Christmas. And again, I don't want to be hard on Tolkien, but Tolkien absolutely hated The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And one of the many reasons he hated it is Father Christmas. Why would Father Christmas be put in the middle of a story that had nothing to do with Father Christmas? But I'm going to assign you into teams right now, and this is C.S. Lewis Bob, What Christmas Means to Me. It's a good read. And then your team is to answer the question, was Lewis right or wrong? I'll bring some back. That's what I like to say. I don't want to take Okay.
Two questions. The first one was in Screwtape Letters, for example, he talks about, he uses, I think it's the Second World War to some extent. In Screwtape Letters, right?
Yes.
So how much of it was his experience that he didn't talk about for John 15? Do you think he used Screwtape Letters in his own experience?
In Screwtape Letters, he uses several analogies, like the big one is D-Day, that God has won. When Jesus Christ came, we won the victory, but we haven't won the war. It's a mopping up operation. But in a very interesting lecture that he gave at Oxford called Learning in Wartime, he talks about the fact that what if in the trenches of World War I, he had jumped over the trench and met a German guy, and they had shot each other and both died. And they both went to heaven, they would probably be laughing and say, ha, ha, ha. And it's because his idea is, this world is not that important. It's the world beyond that's most important. And so, good question, James. But I don't think he really ever gets more personal than that, except the only time I remember in his writing is not in Screw Tape Letters, but in this lecture. I'm going to, well, that's really a good point. And somewhere buried in here I have, let's see what it is. Lewis was, once he became a Christian, he became chaste. And he did not have a sexual relationship. In fact, people, you've anyone seen the movie Shadowlands? You know, Lewis in his 50s fell in love with an American Jewish atheist, very, very rough woman by the name of Joy Davidman, or Helen Davidman. And they got married because Helen Davidman would have to leave England unless she could find a way to stay. And Lewis said, "I'll marry you in a civil ceremony." But they did fall in love. But many Lewis scholars, including Walter Hooper, who was Lewis's last secretary, who's just a wonderful, dear man. He's about 80 years old now. I've heard him several times claim that Lewis never had a sexual relationship with his wife. And Walter Hooper is a very devout Catholic, and so they talk about the perpetual virginity of C.S. Lewis. However, Jamie and I have met Douglas Gresham, who is the stepson of C.S. Lewis, who was one of the two sons of Joy Davidman, and I'll try to be discreet the way Doug talks about it. He says there was sure a lot of motion and movement and sound in the bedroom they shared. So he's pretty sure that they enjoyed a full sexual relationship as husband and wife. But Lewis, throughout his writings, because of his experience, which was a very bad one, and he would say, I'm going to say a warped one, really said that God knows best when it comes to sex. And the chapter on sexual morality and mere Christianity is a wonderful chapter. He's got a book on the four loves. His chapter on Eros is a wonderful book. If I were a single young adult, I would read those chapters and I would heed those chapters. Okay, now, no more excuses. Oh, sorry, one more.
Sorry, just one question. Do you believe that there's a difference in Christianity in the non-Muslims?
Sorry.
Do you believe that there's an influence of Christianity in the non-Muslims? There's Christianity in
Should Christians influence non-Christians?